That is the whole purpose of a union position, or having a union, for the true solidarity of what's happening in our society, in our workforce. So when I think about what should we tackle, or what should our message be, the middle class was built on unionism. Many of us would not be in the middle class had it not been for the formation of a union.
It's important to be part of a union because you have to have a voice.
Welcome to Union Talk. I'm Randy Weingarten.
So welcome to another episode of Union Talk. I'm Randy Weingarten, and I am the president of the AFT. I've been looking forward to this conversation for several weeks already, because this is the conversation about what's happening in America right now. And it's not a conversation about why people voted or didn't vote for Donald Trump as president. It is a conversation about what is happening in our economy right now, what is happening in our society right now, and what is the disconnect between what happened in the election and what's happening every day on the ground. Millions of working and middle-class Americans voted for President Trump. And they voted that way because they believed, yes, it was a close election, but they believed his promise that he would be their champion and that he would bring a better life. And I know in some ways, one of the people that I'm about to introduce, Greg Cruey, who is a social studies teacher in McDowell County, West Virginia, and the president of AFT McDowell. Greg, you and I have talked so much over the course of time about how coal country really turned against Democrats and turned against the Democratic Party because they believed that the party had abandoned the workers of coal, and it became as cultural as it became economic. And another person I'm going to introduce, Ternesha Burroughs, who's a high school math teacher in the Osseo area schools in Hennepin County, Minnesota. Did I get that right? Hennepin, right?
Good job.
And she's the president of our local there. Also, what happened, because people feel completely abandoned, or people felt completely abandoned by a Democratic Party whose middle name used to be labor, whose middle name used to be working people. And so I really wanted to have a conversation with Greg and with Ternesha. And then the third person I'm going to introduce is Damon Silvers, who is one of the smartest economists. I'm sure you're not actually an economist, but the smartest economic person I know, who's been working on a range of economic issues and has a good analysis about what's happening in our economy right now. So this is kind of like, what's the perception, or what was the perception before November? What's happening right now? And what can we, as, Americans, as teachers, as analysts, what can we do about it? But unless we understand it, it's really hard to do something about it. And it's kind of like there's a word in social psychology, cognitive dissonance. The cognitive dissonance between what Donald Trump promised and what he's doing right now, and for people who don't like it, to not make people feel badly if they voted for him, and how we kind of figure out how to make sure we are fighting together on the things that people in America really need. That's part of the conversation I really, really wanted to have. So I just want to say thank you, Greg. Thank you, Ternesha. Thank you, Damon, for being on with us today. I have no idea how the conversation will go or not go, but that's what this Union Talk podcast is about. It's real issues with real people in the field on things that people care about. So thank you, all three of you, for joining me today. So Damon, I want to start with you, just to set the baseline of the conversation. Give us your elevator pitch for what Trump and Musk are doing to the economy and how it is either helping or hurting working people.
Well, Randy, first, it's such a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for having me, and also an honor to be with our brother Greg and sister Tanisha to talk about these issues. So, it's really a kind of crazy story, right? The Trump administration is executing what they swore up and down they were not going to do, which is a sort of radical right-wing agenda that's in the Project 2025, which is premised on the idea that we really don't need government in any sense, in education, in healthcare, in aviation, anywhere, for our economy to prosper. They're out there executing that agenda. And the particular ways they're doing it are doing two things to our economy. And you can see it in the numbers. It's shocking. All right. The first thing they're doing is pretty much across the board doing things that are going to push up prices to ordinary people at the grocery store, which is the opposite of what they said they were going to do, right? If there was one message coming out of the Trump campaign before the election, it was prices are too high, we're going to bring them down. But if you look at what they're doing in every policy area, it is, whether you're talking about their trade policies, their immigration policies, their approach to interest rates, pretty much across the board, they're doing things that are driving up prices. But that's actually not the most seriously destructive thing they're doing. The thing that's really shocking about what they're doing is the volatility, the crazy town, right? The fact that we have 25% tariffs on our largest trading partners and closest allies one day, then the next day we don't, and the next day after that we do again. This creates an environment. In business, they say it's all about risk and return. If you dial up the risk, if you dial up the uncertainty, then business pulls back. Consumers pull back. Everyone pulls back. Everybody hunkers down, pulls money out of the economy, stops doing things. And you see that in the numbers. It's amazing if you look at the consumer data on consumer confidence, data on business confidence. It's like a cliff on January 20th, right? And it's not economics. It's a politically driven economic crisis, but it is very real economically. And it's just begun, meaning that we don't see the impact of this in the numbers on jobs yet, right? But we will, because those numbers lag. But where we see it right now is the numbers that tell us whether people are confident in the economy, whether they're spending money, investing, whether they're pulling back. And those numbers, it was like a different world between January 19th and January 20th. It just shocking.
So, Damon, what I hear you saying, and then I'm going to ask a question. I wanted to ask you a second question, but I want to get to Greg and Tanisha first. But what I hear you saying is, from a business perspective or a consumer perspective, when you have this level of uncertainty, like you don't know, I was talking to the governor, frankly, of Illinois, who was talking about a brewery that was in Illinois and that they may have to go out of business because it's going to cost too much between the aluminum can and the cost of some of the other raw materials to brew beer anymore. And so this thriving business will go out of business because, they can't make the price of beer 25% higher because they get their aluminum right now from Canada. And so that business is basically doing nothing about growing or anything else and is trying to figure out if they have to close down. I think what I'm hearing you say is that's happening in big business too. That's happening in mergers and acquisitions. They're so uncertain that all of this long-term economic activity is stopped. Is that what you're saying?
It's absolutely what I'm saying, Randy, is that anyone in our economy today who has the responsibility to make a decision as to whether or not to invest money in things that create jobs and build our economy, everyone with those kinds of responsibilities has frozen themselves. They've stopped because they don't know. Partly because they look at the decisions that the Trump administration is making and they appear to be destructive from their perspective.
Yeah.
But even more importantly, they don't know. They don't know what the economic environment's going to be tomorrow. They don't know what their cost structure will be tomorrow. They don't know. And it's irresponsible to put money at risk if you have no idea what's going to happen next. And this is the environment that the Trump administration has created from a stable economy when they came in. Right? An economy where inflation had receded, where we had close to full employment, where we had robust economic growth, a rising stock market. They have purely through politics created a situation in which people are terrified to engage in productive activity because the risk is high.
So it's not a recessionary force here. It's not something else that's happened. It's kind of like man-made.
Yes.
Is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's not just man-made. It's politically made.
It's politically made.
It's politically made.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I want to do is I was going to ask both Greg and Ternesha questions initially about Social Security and Medicare. But Greg, I want to talk about the flood in McDowell that just happened, because also I want to see if people will help us help people in McDowell, you know, like the flood that is the worst in 100 years. But this is how I want to connect it. I always see the federal government as like the provider of last resort. So if, God forbid, there's a hurricane or like the fires in Los Angeles or, you know, the flood just in McDowell, that FEMA, Federal Emergency Management, or other things. I mean, Ternesha, remember the bridges that collapsed in Minnesota a few years ago? That the federal government, the Army Corps of Engineers, FEMA, others, they're going to come in and they're going to help. And yet, we have all of these kind of chainsaw cuts by Elon Musk on the federal government. So what do we do? You just had this biggest flood that has happened in 100 years in McDowell. It's not as if the McDowell community has the economic wherewithal to help, or frankly, maybe West Virginia itself, although we're trying and they're trying. What do you need from the federal government to recover? And what's the conversations in McDowell right now about whether or not you'll get it?
It took a while for FEMA to come in, and we weren't sure there was a window of time where everybody was afraid they weren't going to come at all. I told somebody recently, the last time FEMA came in because of a flood, they went to people and they would say, you know, this house to repair it will cost $20,000 and the house is only worth $18,000. How about if we write you a check and you move away? And that's what happened. We lost a big chunk of the population, 10% of the population. I don't know the exact number, moved to Mercer County or Wyoming County. And that depopulation has a logical effect on the school system then, because there are fewer kids to teach, and has a logical effect on business because there's fewer people spending money. It's really hard at this point to try and say this is what we want in terms of we want services restored. This flood had a devastating impact on infrastructure, and the long-term process of restoring the roads, which weren't very good and weren't incredibly safe to start with, and the amount of county water line that was destroyed, those are the big things. Electricity got back on pretty quickly, but those underground pipes, replacing those pipes is a big deal. We were very fortunate that not a single school was damaged significantly.
Right.
And we had a lot of people step up. We had schools open as emergency shelters. We saw a lot of volunteer time. We saw a lot of church organizations come in and, hand out food and other materials more than we could physically handle, to be honest. But when things are bad to a particular level, you look at it and you say, what should the goal for restoration be? Should we, God forbid that we try and go back to what we were when we started, because that was bad. It was bad before the flood.
Right. You need to rebuild.
The question is, what should we be shooting for now? And is this crisis an opportunity for something better? And I don't think anybody's decided that yet. I don't think we know the answer to that question.
And, you think about all of what you and we and others did to try to make a commitment to McDowell, to try to, build housing, get people, bolster the schools. And, this is, I think that you're talking about the kind of psychology around, the can-do psychology around what we expect our federal government to do. We expect our federal government not to give us a hand out, but to give us a hand up. And that's the kind of stuff that, it feels harder to navigate it right now than it frankly has with any Republican or Democratic president up until now. That's been my experience. I was really curious. I'm so glad to see you, and I was really curious about yours.
Well, the thing that comes to me as I think about this, we don't feel as though the immediate crisis, the urgency of the immediate crisis is really the issue. Our problem transcends partisan politics and is systemic and dates back 50, 75, 100 years. And it doesn't matter who's in power or what efforts are being made to solve the symptomatic problems, the systemic problems continue. And that's really the issue for the people around us. They think that life is going to be better off because they won the culture wars. And I hate talking about the culture wars.
Right.
And they don't look at the economics because the economics have always been this way.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said it that way. They think they're better off because they won the culture wars. But the culture wars don't put food on the table. And the culture wars don't create a middle class. And the culture wars don't make sure that we have the safety net. And in some ways, by weaponizing the culture wars, this has put a damper on what we need to do on the economic wars. And that kind of gets me back to the earlier question I was going to ask both Greg and Ternesha. And I'll start this time with you, Ternesha, because I know that you and your dad, I hope you don't mind me raising this, have gone through a really tough time with his Social Security benefits recently presumably because of the changes and the cuts, that DOGE has made, that the president and that Elon Musk has made in terms of Social Security. So you want to talk a little bit about that? And as you do that, just for our viewers to know, this, one of the Saturdays in March, we are actually going to be in front of the White Plains Social Security office protesting those kind of cuts, putting a face on those kind of cuts. But Ternesha, could you talk about it for a bit about what happened?
Yeah, sure. So first, my dad is a veteran. He's a Navy veteran, and he's retired 40 years in Miami-Dade public schools. And so he has earned his pension. He has earned his Social Security. He has earned his VA benefits. And he's currently 73. And I have been managing his care and finances since about 2018 when he had a massive stroke. So we've never had any problems with his Social Security. I set it up for direct deposit. I've done all the things that, children are supposed to do for their parents as they age, and making sure I have all the documentation. As you said in your introduction, I'm a math teacher, so the finances and the money is always going to be right. And
you want to do it for me too, please.
So, I'm constantly monitoring his accounts because I do know that, there can be people that try to take advantage of our senior population, especially those that may, experience some health concerns where they can't actually advocate and articulate for themselves, which is the case for my father, who has aphasia from his stroke. But like I said, we haven't had any problems. And then all of a sudden, January hits in February, and it's like his Social Security didn't hit his account. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. And then when I called, there's all these new rules on verification of identity. And I was just like, what is going on? And then they were like, well, you've got to come in. And I was like, he doesn't even live in Florida anymore. It was just a whole bunch of, circling, transferring. And because they are firing so many people, it's almost like you don't even know. You have to constantly write down who you're talking to, what day you spoke to them, because the next time you call or the next day you call, they may no longer be working for the Social Security Administration. And it took almost 30 days for me to get things back on track. I'm fortunate, or my dad is fortunate, that he has me, that I'm able to call and advocate for him. But it really breaks my heart that he would even have to go through all of this extra when he has been on Social Security since he retired, since he was 65, and he's currently 73. And then not to mention, his not being able to receive any services from the VA, like completely just stopped, access to counselors, access to other veterans who have traumatic brain injuries. I just don't think any of us asked for this. And I don't see how, if your true intention is to look for fraud and quote unquote waste, how could something that we as Americans pay into be waste? Because that's what I pay into. That's what you take from my earnings every paycheck. So then when it's time for me to collect on my earnings, how could any of that be waste? That's the part where I'm really struggling.
And I think first off, thank God your dad has you, because you can help him navigate through all of this. And I hear stories like when we get to the issues around Medicaid and Medicare. I remember, how hard it was for me to navigate through the systems a few years ago. And, people always have a hard time navigating through this because the government, let's be honest, the government is never perfect at being efficient and effective in dealing with all of us. But when they start talking about, and this, I want to go back to you, Greg, because you're thinking about it right now. If you start talking about getting rid of $800 billion in terms of Medicaid, so you can pay for, billionaires' tax cuts. Medicaid is a really important feature of the safety net in McDowell County, as is Medicare, as is Social Security. So what's the conversations, not just you thinking about, what's the conversations in McDowell right now about all of this stuff? Because
they're not talking about.
Wow.
I mean, the economics at this point, everything Damon said is absolutely true, but incrementally it hasn't seeped down to the level where people where I live. And, when I think of the teachers that I represent teachers from 5 or 6 surrounding counties, because 40% of our workforce can't find a place to live in McDowell County. I don't live in McDowell County, but it hasn't seeped into where we are. And nobody feels a difference at this point between one administration and the other economically. But if they were to do away with school lunch tomorrow,
right,
that would be catastrophic. If they were to take Medicaid cards away from the kids in my room, one of the things that, is astonishing as a social studies teacher is that when we talk about those sorts of things, they have no clue that they have a Medicaid card because somebody thinks they're poor. Can I say that word out loud? Poor.
Yes.
They don't know that. They don't understand that Social Security disability, if somebody gets that because of their status as a special ed student, is, along those same lines. It's need-based. They really, really don't understand those particular things at the grade level that I teach. And the adults don't talk about it at this point. But those would be far more devastating than the price of eggs going up or, nobody buys a new car.
So when the fact that the USDA, the SNAP benefits and all of that are part of this plan to cut them to get to a billionaire tax cut, they'll feel it. What I'm hearing you say is they'll feel it after the fact if we can't get them reversed.
They'll feel that after the fact. And the level of news coverage, the fluency with information, they may not know who to blame for it.
Right.
But they won't feel it until those things start to trickle down. And it'll be the cut in safety net services that's more damaging. McKinney-Vento means something where I live.
Yeah.
And if those sorts of services begin to be cut, that will be much worse than the rate of inflation.
I mean, I was going to say to you, Ternesha, you have been out there in some ways, look at what Minnesota did. Minnesota then wrapped services around free lunch to make sure that we had free breakfast and free lunch, and to make sure it was universal, so that nobody had to say, I'm poor to get a free lunch.
Yes.
What do you think would happen in terms of Minnesota if, all of a sudden the SNAP program went belly up for, tax cuts for the rich?
And so I agree, there's populations that's still out there buying new cars, but for those that are receiving those SNAP benefits, they're not buying new cars. So that type of stuff is not impacting them. But what I do think will hit first is those Medicaid cuts.
Right.
Because many of our school systems, through third-party billing, we are offering services to students, and that reimbursement that districts receive is how we pay for the staff that's providing the service.
Right.
So when you can no longer get speech language services at the school because that piece of Medicaid was cut, then it's like, oh, now it's impacting me. Now I see what everybody else is talking about. I think that our community as a state will feel Medicaid impact before they feel a cash SNAP benefit impact.
Well, that actually brings me to my next question to Damon, because what I'm hearing from both of you is part of the reason why on all of what's happening with the Department of Education, and the AFT has really engaged in an education campaign. What does the Department of Education do? Like the funding and putting a face on it. So like really saying this is what Title I goes for, and giving a bunch of examples so that people see what Title I pays for, like after school activities, summer school, lowering class size, computers, things, reading specialists, things like this. We've done the same in terms of IDEA. What I'm hearing both of you say is that we should really be doing the same thing in terms of Medicaid and SNAP and things like that, just so we give a picture to people about what these things are for. Because the education, and you said it, Craig, you said there's not a whole lot of media anymore anywhere. And people then get into what they believe, and the facts be damned in some ways. So this is part of, I think, a campaign we have to do, because the fear I have is when you lose it, you can't get it back. And so when it gets lost, and then all of a sudden that's when people see it, it is almost impossible to get things back once they're lost. But I want to go to Damon, which is, okay, you and I know the economy hasn't worked for working people for many years. I mean, you just heard Greg talk about it in terms of McDowell. It's like, it's not even conceivable that it's in our imagination that the economy could work, because it hasn't worked for many years. So what do I'm not talking about the Democrats, I'm talking about us as a labor movement. What do we as a labor movement need to do, not just to talk about the horribles that could happen, but what do we need to do to talk about an opportunity agenda? Or do we talk about an opportunity agenda? How do we go about dealing with this loss of hope that people have, and the sense that the anger has displaced hope. But, culture wars, fighting culture wars, that means the anger has displaced hope in terms of the American dream. What do we do after hearing a conversation like this?
Randy, I think this question is critical. People have moved agendas of division, of culture wars as a response, as a way of taking political advantage of decades of economics that have hurt working people and hurt working people's communities. And in some cases, Southern West Virginia being one of them, devastated those communities, absolutely devastated them. And what we need is an agenda of hope, an agenda that's about opportunity, but that is also really clear that we're going to build an economy that structurally can provide prosperity, good jobs, right, advancement across generations, economic security. Right? And this requires, first, it requires that we have strong, healthy educational and healthcare systems, right? So that when we talk about a tax on Medicaid, or tax on the educational system, the dismantling of the Department of Education or the defunding of local school systems like the ones in McDowell, what we're talking about is ripping the foundations out from under our economy. So first we need to understand that those systems have to be built up, not torn down, because education and healthcare are the foundations of productivity, which are the foundations of economic activity of all kinds. But then on top of that, we need to have a strategy that's built around investing in our country, building up our competitive capacity as a country, and building up our workforce, and making sure that our workforce is that all the working people are given the tools to create prosperity and have the power to bargain for the benefits of prosperity so that we get a positive, not a downward spiral, but a positive spiral, a process by which prosperity feeds on prosperity. And the only way you get that is if prosperity is shared, right? That's how the 20th century was the American century, because we as a nation learned how to do these things. We learned how to invest in ourselves, how to share prosperity, how to have it build on itself, right? While other countries destroyed themselves in conflict and culture wars, frankly, right?
Yeah.
That's what we need to do now. And the truth is that our country is in a position which, if we did that, if we turned toward creating broad-based prosperity, toward investing in our people, in our communities, in our industries, if we did that, right, that we are positioned to be more prosperous, more secure than ever before, and for our people everywhere to lead better lives than they have in the past. It is really true that America's greatest days are in front of us, but only if we learn the lessons of how we built our greatest days in the first place, which is through public policies that built up both the economics and the voice and power of working people. That's how America became America.
So, as people could guess, this is not the first time Damon and I have had this conversation in terms of the back and forth. But I wanted you to say this on this podcast, and I wanted to basically then ask Greg and Ternesha a question. Both of you are leaders in the union. We spend a lot of time basically, fighting in Congress for more money for Title I. Now we're fighting against the cuts to Medicaid or the cuts to, SNAP or the cuts to, to education. And we're fighting against that because we think the priority should be students, not tax cuts for the rich. But we almost never talk about what Damon just did. We almost never talk about what is the future look like in terms of on a macroeconomic basis, in terms of what shared prosperity means. What should this be part and parcel of our education campaign for our own members? Should it be part of what we do to try and have that better America? Would it work if we tried to have these conversations in a broader way? Or should we as a union, very much focus on just the stuff that's right in front of us? And this, in this moment, is a really important question to grapple with, And so I'm asking two of our leaders in our union what you think.
It's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's hard.
I think the first thing that came to mind when you were asking the question, Randy, was our slogan of "It's better in a union," right?
Right.
And I was recently in a very heated conversation with someone about the benefits of being in the union. And I take my corporate counterparts, friends of mine that are constantly complaining, or maybe not complaining, but they're always making note of how women in private sector make, I don't know what it is now, 60 cents to the dollar for, compared to men in similar roles. And I would always say, I don't have those problems.
Right.
Because I'm in a union job. It's the one job where I'm not paid less than a man. It's the one job where I'm not paid less because I'm Black. It's the one job I'm not paid different because I'm secondary and somebody's elementary, or I'm mathematics and somebody's art. It is the one opportunity or the one place where the playing field is the same, because that is the whole purpose of a union position, or having a union, for the true solidarity of what's happening in our society, in our workforce. So when I think about, what should we tackle, or what should our message be, the middle class was built on unionism. Many of us would not be in the middle class had it not been for the formation of a union. My parents, as Black people growing up in the 60s and 50s, they would not have been able to give my siblings and I the opportunities that we have had it not been for them having union jobs. So I think that our message of "it's better in the union" should be our consistent message, and a message that we continue to have, while simultaneously attacking or keeping the current issues in the face.
On the front burner.
Of saying, listen, this is one reason why we need to continue to be in solidarity with others. This is one reason why we need to continue to not be, this is the educators union, this is the nurses union, this is the trades. No, we are all in this together as union siblings. And if I need to only shop at one particular produce store because that's where it's union, folks, then that's what I do, right? We have to make sure that we help keep our own people employed. So if we're going to pull back, as Damon said, I'm going to wait and see what's going to happen before I start to make big purchases, or before I start to do things. Okay, well, I'm going to go buy my eggs from the union grocery store, because I know that making that purchase is going to keep another union sibling in a job so they can provide for their families. The same way they're going to send their kid to public school to make sure that my teachers and myself have a job and we can continue to move forward. I think that we also need to put the information out there for our union members so they can see how much of, I think about how much of my district dollars is coming from the federal government, and where is it going, right? Yeah. These 8-10 center-based positions, that's what that money is, right? And when you let the community know, like, this is how we're able to afford a ASD, DCD teacher, because we're getting that money directly from the federal government, especially in the rural areas where their operating budget is truly for their general education students. Right. And I think the more that we make people know how those federal dollars trickle down, I think that's important, but also it's better in a union. And so regardless of what occupation you hold, if you have the opportunity to be in solidarity, you should.
Thank you so much. And I think about this question a lot, Greg, because I think about how often, you, AFTs, we did so much at a local level, but without the help of the state government in West Virginia, without the kind of help to try to get the investments that we needed into McDowell, that people saw what we did and have seen what we did, but the fundamentals that Damon was talking about didn't change because we didn't have governments that were willing to invest in kind of new industries and broad-based industries. In some ways, I juxtapose what happened in McDowell to what happened in Syracuse, New York, or what's now happening in places in Minnesota where the chips industries are now coming in and building new plants and building more manufacturing. But, the federal government, that in a bipartisan way under, the former president did so much to make that happen. And so I think about this question all the time when I think about McDowell. How do we advocate for opportunity? How do we use the union to do that? And is that just too much at this moment when we have so many primal issues to focus on? And, just like Ternesha, I kind of wanted your take on it too.
When I think about what Damon said about tariffs, tariffs might hurt the average family in McDowell County if they go to buy a washing machine or a refrigerator because the price of the materials in those things have gone up. So the prices have gone up. They have to drive to another county to buy one of those. I don't think there's any place in the county that sells washing machines or refrigerators. And there aren't any businesses that are going to be hurt by the tariffs because there are no businesses. There's not somebody manufacturing something. There's not somebody within the county. There are coal mines. And then the biggest employer in the county is my boss, the school system. And so that's part of the issue with this. I don't know how we get industry, and we can blame the government at this point, and they might play a role, but it goes back to the coal industry itself.
Right.
And 100 years ago when they wanted to monopolize the workforce and they kept other people out. And it goes back to not having a 4-lane highway that comes through any part of the county at this point. Our problems, I would hate to see the union confine itself to labor issues, to simply be an expert on employment law. The government is a double-edged sword. On the other hand, we're dependent on the government and the government's goodwill and help. 7 years ago, we had a strike, and it was over health care. There are proposals on the table to simply dissolve that health care organization at the moment, and I don't know what happens next if they do that, if they dissolve the public employees' health insurance. There's so many uncertainties at this point. It's difficult to talk about, but the problem is bigger than the borders of economics. And, I tell people that our problem after 100 years of poverty, with the drug issues that we have, with the family dysfunction that we have, with the idea that half of the kids in my school probably don't live with either biological parent, at some point the problems become spiritual in nature, and you have to look at a more holistic solution than what can we do economically. And the union has got to find a way to, if they want to change life where I am, we have to find a way to embrace that and be willing to lead in a broad manner and to address the human depravity that is on display. It's a very holistic approach, and nothing is accomplished by going piecemeal and picking one thing and just addressing that one thing.
Well, this has always been my hope when we have a podcast like this. We're talking, these are real issues. They affected people differently in this last election in terms of being willing to, so many people to shake the system up to its core because they want it to be changed. And now people are saying, no, oops, this was not the change we wanted. But we as unionists, I mean, this is part of the reason why young people, I think, are so high on unions. I don't mean high drug high. I mean high attitude high on unions, because they see that what we provide, what we enable is hope and opportunity. And that when you work together and you connect the dots and you do the education, but you also do the advocacy, that what we can accomplish is something that's impossible to do alone. And that, what you just said, Greg, about that kind of connecting the dots, that kind of seeing the holistic, was what you said, Ternesha, in terms of it's better in a union. And the kind of like how, and what I saw right after the election, we did polling of our members. And the one issue that really unified people, I mean, our members overwhelmingly voted for Harris. But the one thing that really unified people was that over 90% of our members said, when asked, what should we do going forward? And they said, we should keep on fighting for a better life for people. We should keep on fighting for opportunity for all. Yes, we have to make sure that we do that for ourselves too, obviously. But that should be for the people who connect to each other, for the people who do, basically, we're in the business of helping others, whether we're educators or healthcare professionals or public employees. Keep doing that work. And keep doing that work now, regardless of who's president of the United States. And that's what I hear from both of you as well. And I couldn't be more grateful to you for the work that you do, both as teachers and as trade unionists. And Damon, thank you for always making sure we can see the world as it is and the solutions that we should have in front of us. I really appreciate the conversation with all of you today. We went well over our time, but I just really want to say thank you to Greg, thank you to Ternesha, thank you to Damon. And this is Randi Weingarten on Union Talk.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Union Talk. Remember to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and tune in every other week for a new episode. Thank you, be safe, and be well.